The massive doors of the Galactic Council chambers stretched 400 meters high, their surface carved from a single piece of crystallized starlight that had taken 3 centuries to harvest. As they slowly opened, Ambassador David Martinez felt the weight of 10,000 alien eyes upon him. The chamber beyond defied human comprehension, a vast amphitheater that seemed to bend space itself, accommodating representatives from over 800 species across 12 galactic arms. Martinez stepped forward onto the platform that materialized beneath his feet, carrying him toward the center of the greatest governing body in known existence. The air itself hummed with translated languages, pheromone communications, and electromagnetic frequencies that his enhanced earpiece struggled to convert into understandable speech. Towering above him on crystalline platforms, creatures of impossible diversity watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. The Galactic Council had ruled for over 4,000 years, maintaining order across millions of worlds through a combination of superior technology, ancient wisdom, and overwhelming force. No species had ever challenged their authority and survived. Today, humanity would test that record. Prime Speaker Vorthak rose from his throne, his massive reptilian form casting shadows across the lower platforms. His scales shifted from deep blue to warning crimson as he spoke, his voice carrying the authority of eons. David Martinez of the species designated Terra-Human, you stand before the Council to answer for your world's unprecedented violations of galactic law. Martinez remained perfectly still, his calm expression betraying nothing of the storm brewing behind his eyes. The charges were serious. Harboring refugees from the destruction wars, refusing to surrender mining rights to established galactic powers, and most damning of all, developing military technology without council oversight. Any one of these offenses typically resulted in planetary sanctions. All 3 together usually meant complete subjugation. The council recognizes the speaker, Vorthak continued, his voice echoing through dimensional translators to reach every corner of the vast chamber. State your world's defense. Martinez looked up at the assembled representatives, his gaze moving slowly across species that had conquered star systems before Earth had developed agriculture. When he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly through the chamber without any technological amplification, a simple human trick that nonetheless sent ripples of surprise through the alien assembly. Honored Council, my world thanks you for this opportunity to address the charges brought against us. However, before I begin our defense, I have a question for this distinguished body. A murmur of shock rippled through the chamber. In 4 millennia of council proceedings, no accused representative had ever begun their defense with a question. Several of the more aggressive species began chittering angrily at what they perceived as human arrogance. Vorthak's scales darkened to deep purple, a color that in his species indicated dangerous curiosity. This is highly irregular. What question could possibly be relevant to your world's crimes? Martinez smiled, and something in that expression made several of the nearer representatives shift uncomfortably. I simply wish to understand the legal basis for this trial. Specifically, under what authority does this council claim jurisdiction over humanity? The silence that followed was deafening. In the council's long history, no species had ever questioned their fundamental right to govern galactic affairs. That authority was assumed, built into the very structure of interstellar civilization. High Arbiter Nexus, an ancient being whose crystalline form had grown roots into the chamber floor itself, spoke for the first time in 3 centuries. The Council's authority derives from the founding compact, established when the first civilizations united to bring order to chaos. All sapient species fall under our protection and guidance. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. And when exactly did humanity sign this founding compact? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. For several long moments, no one spoke. The truth was obvious to everyone present. Humanity had never been asked to sign the compact. Like every other species the Council had encountered, they had simply been informed of their new status as subjects. Vorthak's massive form leaned forward, his voice carrying undertones of threat. The compact applies to all sapient life, regardless of when they achieved space travel. Your species membership was automatic upon your first interstellar contact. I see, Martinez replied. So membership in the Council is mandatory, non-negotiable, and retroactive. How very interesting. He paused, his eyes scanning the assembled aliens with new intensity. Tell me, honored representatives, how many of your species were given a choice in joining this body? The question struck the chamber like a physical blow. Every species present knew the answer. None had been given a choice. The Council's expansion had always been through conquest, absorption, or simple declaration of authority. The concept of voluntary membership was alien to their understanding of governance. Several of the newer Council members began to shift uncomfortably as they realized where the humans' questions were leading. The Cathay representative, whose species had been welcomed into the Council only 2 centuries ago, actually took a step backward on his platform. Martinez continued his verbal assault with the precision of a surgeon. I ask because my species has reviewed the legal framework of Council authority quite thoroughly. We've studied your laws, your precedents, your enforcement mechanisms, and we've discovered something remarkable. He gestured to the air above him, and to everyone's shock, a holographic display materialized, somehow bypassing every security system in the chamber. The display showed legal documents, star charts, and what appeared to be detailed analyses of Council operations spanning centuries. The Council's authority rests entirely on the assumption that superior force equals legitimate governance. You rule because you can enforce your will, not because you have any inherent right to do so, which brings me to the real purpose of today's proceedings. The hologram shifted to show something that made every representative in the chamber freeze in shock. Detailed schematics of their own defense systems, fleet positions, and technological capabilities. Information that should have been impossible for a primitive species to obtain. You see, Martinez continued conversationally, humanity has a peculiar relationship with authority. We tend to recognize it only when it's earned through consent, rather than imposed through force, and we've been preparing for this conversation for quite some time. The displays around the chamber began showing new information. Human ships emerging from stealth positions throughout Council space, manufacturing facilities that had somehow escaped detection for decades, and technological capabilities that shouldn't have existed for a species barely 50 years past their first interstellar flight. Vorthax scales had gone completely white, a color that indicated genuine fear. This is impossible. Our surveillance networks monitor all human activities. Your technological development is closely regulated. Martinez's laugh was soft but carried clearly through the shocked silence. Regulated based on what you allowed us to show you. Did you really think a species clever enough to reach the stars would be naive enough to reveal their true capabilities to potential conquerors? The chamber erupted in chaos as representatives began shouting in dozens of languages, demanding explanations, crying for security forces, and in some cases simply fleeing toward the exits. The image of humanity as a minor controllable species was crumbling before their eyes. Silence. Vorthax's roar restored momentary order. What do you want, human? Your world cannot seriously believe it can challenge the combined might of 800 species. Martinez's expression grew deadly serious. We don't want to challenge anyone, Prime Speaker. We want to make you an offer. The same offer we would have made 50 years ago if you had approached us with respect instead of demands. He gestured again, and the display showed something unprecedented. Human fleets working alongside alien vessels, joint scientific projects, and what appeared to be genuine cooperation between species. Humanity offers the Council a choice, Martinez said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You can continue attempting to rule through fear and force, in which case you'll discover what happens when you threaten a species that views your authority as illegitimate. Or you can join us in building something better, a true alliance of equals working toward mutual benefit. The silence stretched on as the implications sank in. For the first time in 4 millennia, the Galactic Council was being offered a partnership instead of demanding submission. And for the first time in their history, they weren't sure they had the power to refuse. The war began 3 hours after Ambassador Martinez left the Council chambers. Not with the formal declarations and ceremonial exchanges typical of galactic conflicts, but with a simple message broadcast across every communication network in known space. Humanity regrets that peaceful resolution was not possible. Educational demonstrations will now commence. Admiral Lisa Thompson stood on the bridge of the stealth ship Midnight's Edge, watching the draconian battle fleet through sensors that shouldn't have existed. The massive alien vessels moved in perfect formation toward Earth, their hulls gleaming with the confidence of a species that had never known defeat. 200 ships, each one capable of cracking continents, led by the legendary War Master Grixtal himself. The Draconians had volunteered to be the Council's enforcement arm, eager to demonstrate their superiority over the upstart humans. Their reptilian warriors had conquered 17 star systems in the past century, and their battle doctrine was considered the finest in the galaxy. They approached Earth expecting to find a frightened world begging for mercy. Instead, they found empty space. "War Master," reported the Draconian sensor officer, his voice tight with confusion, "we're detecting no defensive installations around the human homeworld. No orbital platforms, no fleet formations, nothing." Grixtal's massive form shifted in his command throne, his golden scales reflecting the light of Earth's sun. "Scan again. Use deep-range sensors. They must be hiding somewhere." The search continued for another hour, revealing nothing but civilian traffic and commercial satellites. To all appearances, Earth was completely defenseless. The human population continued their daily activities as if unaware that annihilation was approaching. "Perhaps they've already surrendered," suggested the tactical officer. "Some species lose the will to fight when they realize the futility of resistance." Grixtal's laugh was like grinding stone. "Then this will be even easier than expected. Prepare to establish orbital control. We'll give them one chance to submit before we begin bombarding their industrial centers." The Draconian fleet moved into attack formation around Earth, their weapons charging with energies that could sterilize continents. Grixtal opened a communication channel to the planet below, his voice carrying the authority of inevitable conquest. "Humans of Terra, I am War Master Grixtal of the Draconian Empire. Your world has been judged by the Galactic Council and found guilty of crimes against the natural order. You have one final opportunity to surrender unconditionally and accept Council authority. Respond within 10 minutes or face the consequences." The response came immediately, but not from the planet. It came from what had appeared to be empty space around the Draconian fleet. "War Master Grixtal," said a calm female voice that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This is Admiral Thompson of the Terran Defense Force. We appreciate your offer, but we must decline. However, we would like to extend a counter-offer." Grixtal's head snapped toward his sensor officer. "Where's that transmission coming from?" "Unknown, sir. It appears to be broadcast from multiple points around our formation, but sensors show nothing." The human voice continued with maddening calm. "We propose a demonstration of why conquest-based governance is no longer viable. Please observe carefully, as this lesson will be brief but comprehensive." That was when the Draconian fleet discovered they were not alone in the empty space around Earth. The first sign was a subtle shift in the starlight around them. What had appeared to be vacuum began to ripple and distort, revealing the outlines of objects that had been perfectly invisible moments before. Not ships exactly, but structures that seemed to bend light and space around themselves. "Stealth technology," breathed the sensor officer. "But our scanners should have detected any known cloaking system." Grixtal watched in growing unease as more and more human constructs revealed themselves. They weren't arranged in traditional battle formations, but seemed to surround his fleet in three-dimensional patterns that made no tactical sense. Some appeared to be weapons platforms, others looked like sensor arrays, and still others defied classification entirely. "How many?" Grixtal demanded, counting. "Sir, we're detecting over 3,000 individual constructs, and they appear to be growing." The War Master's golden scales began to shift toward the darker colors that indicated alarm. Growing. The human constructs were indeed expanding, not in size but in number. What had looked like solid objects began to separate into smaller components, each one revealing itself to be a cluster of even smaller units. Within minutes, the space around Earth was filled with what appeared to be millions of tiny vessels, each one no larger than a fighter but clearly under intelligent control. Admiral Thompson's voice returned, still carrying that same unnerving calm. "War Master, what you're observing is humanity's approach to space warfare. While other species build larger and more powerful individual vessels, we prefer distributed systems. Each of those units you're seeing is autonomous, capable of independent action, and networked with all the others." Grixtal studied his tactical displays with growing dread. The human swarm wasn't attacking, but it had completely surrounded his fleet. More disturbing, his sensors couldn't determine what weapons the tiny vessels carried, if any. "This is some kind of trick," he announced, more to reassure himself than his crew. No civilization could construct so many vessels without our intelligence networks detecting the construction. You're absolutely right, Admiral Thompson agreed. We couldn't build so many ships without detection. That's why we didn't build them at all. The tactical display shifted to show the human swarm in greater detail, and Grixtal felt his blood chill. The tiny vessels weren't constructed, they were grown. Biological organisms with technological enhancements, bred and trained rather than manufactured. Each one was a living creature capable of thought, adaptation, and most terrifyingly, reproduction. Living ships. The sensor officer whispered. They've created living warships. The implications were staggering. Traditional space combat relied on logistics, manufacturing capacity, and the ability to replace losses. But an enemy whose fleet could literally breed replacements faster than they could be destroyed changed every assumption about prolonged warfare. Grixtal made the decision that had served his species well for centuries. All ships prepare to engage. Demonstrate draconian superiority. The fleet's weapons opened fire simultaneously, unleashing enough destructive power to vaporize small moons. Energy beams and kinetic projectiles filled the space around Earth with lethal light, and absolutely nothing happened to the human swarm. Impossible, Grixtal snarled. Our weapons are striking their targets. Why aren't they being destroyed? The answer came from his own sensor officer, his voice thick with disbelief. Sir, our weapons are hitting the targets, but the energy is being absorbed. Somehow, they're converting our attacks into usable power. The human vessels had indeed absorbed the draconian barrage, but not through advanced shields or armor. Instead, they had simply opened themselves up like flowers, allowing the destructive energy to pass through specialized organs that converted it directly into biological energy. The attack that should have annihilated them had instead fed them. Admiral Thompson's voice returned, now carrying a hint of something that might have been amusement. Thank you for the demonstration, War Master. Your weapons are quite impressive. Our bioships appreciate the nourishment. Grixtal watched in horror as the human swarm began to move, not with the mechanical precision of traditional fleets, but with the fluid grace of living creatures. They flowed around his ships like schools of fish, their movements unpredictable and beautiful. War Master, his tactical officer reported, they're not attacking us. They're studying us. The human bioships had indeed begun to circle the draconian vessels, their sensors probing every surface, analyzing every system, learning the construction and capabilities of ships that had conquered star systems. But they made no aggressive moves, offered no threats. What are they doing? Grixtal demanded. Admiral Thompson answered his unspoken question. We're learning, War Master. Each of our bioships is now carrying a complete analysis of draconian military technology. In approximately 6 hours, they'll return to their breeding pools and share that knowledge with the next generation. By tomorrow, every human bioship in existence will know exactly how to counter your weapons, your defenses, and your tactics. The true horror of what Grixtal faced began to sink in. The humans hadn't just created living weapons. They had created an enemy that learned from every encounter and passed that knowledge to offspring that could be produced faster than traditional ships could be built. This is madness, he whispered. No species fights this way. No species has needed to, Admiral Thompson replied. But humanity learned long ago that when you're outnumbered, you don't try to match your enemy's strength. You evolve past it. The bioships began to withdraw as suddenly as they had appeared, flowing back toward Earth like a tide returning to shore. But their message was clear. The draconian fleet, for all its power and reputation, was now obsolete. Grixtal stared at the planet below, knowing that everything he had believed about warfare had just been proven wrong. The humans hadn't defeated him through superior firepower or tactics. The Shadowkin had ruled the dark spaces between stars for over 2 millennia, existing in the void where light never touched and conventional matter held no meaning. They were beings of pure energy wrapped in darkness, capable of traveling through dimensions that other species couldn't even perceive. When the Galactic Council needed enemies to simply disappear, they called upon the Shadowkin. Empress Nixara materialized in the council chamber of her realm, a space that existed between the folds of reality itself. Her form was barely visible even to her own kind, a writhing mass of controlled darkness occasionally pierced by points of light that might have been eyes or stars or something else entirely. The organic creatures grow bold, she communicated to her assembled lieutenants through methods that bypassed physical reality entirely. First they humiliate the Draconians, now they dare to challenge the eternal order itself. Perhaps it is time they learned what dwells in the spaces they fear to explore. The Shadowkin had watched humanity's recent demonstration with interest rather than concern. Bioships and evolutionary warfare were clever innovations, but they relied on physical matter and conventional energy. The children of darkness fought battles in dimensions where such concepts held no meaning. Deploy the Void Fleet, Nixara commanded. Show these humans what true terror looks like. The response was immediate but invisible to any conventional sensors. Across the galaxy, reality began to develop holes. Not physical tears, but absences where the Shadowkin fleet emerged from their native dimension. They appeared as moving patches of absolute darkness that consumed light, energy, and matter with equal hunger. Admiral Thompson received the first reports while reviewing the aftermath of the Draconian encounter. The descriptions from her scattered. Observation posts made little sense. Ships that weren't. Ships attacking bases that remained physically intact but somehow stopped functioning. Admiral, reported Captain Williams from the Science Division, we're receiving distress calls from research stations throughout the Outer Rim. They're reporting attacks by entities that appear to exist partially outside normal spacetime. Thompson studied the incoming data with growing fascination. Show me the tactical analysis. The holographic display revealed something unprecedented. Attack patterns that moved through space in ways that violated basic physics. The Shadowkin vessels appeared to phase in and out of reality at will, striking targets from directions that didn't exist in three-dimensional space. Fascinating, Thompson murmured. They're using dimensional warfare, attacking from parallel realities where our defenses don't exist. Her aide, Lieutenant Chen, frowned at the display. How do we fight an enemy that exists in dimensions we can't access? Thompson's smile was sharp with anticipation. We don't. We make them fight us in dimensions they can't escape. The response was unlike anything humanity had attempted before. Instead of sending conventional forces to meet the Shadowkin threat, Thompson deployed something that had been theoretical until now, quantum anchor arrays. Dr. Sarah Kim, the lead physicist on the project, had spent 3 years developing the technology after studying captured council databases. The principle is simple, she explained to the assembled fleet commanders. If you can't reach an enemy in their dimension, you drag them into yours. The quantum anchors were deployed throughout human space, creating a web of devices that could detect and interact with parallel dimensional structures. But instead of trying to attack the Shadowkin in their native realm, the anchors began to alter the fundamental constants of local spacetime. Empress Nixara first noticed the change as her fleet approached. The human research station at Kepler 442, the comfortable darkness that had surrounded her forces for millennia, began to feel unstable, as if reality itself was becoming unreliable. Report, she commanded her fleet commanders. Unknown interference, Empress. Our dimensional phase generators are experiencing unexpected resistance. It's as if spacetime itself is becoming thicker. Nixara expanded her consciousness to examine the phenomenon directly. What she discovered sent waves of confusion through her dark essence. The humans had somehow altered the local structure of reality, making it increasingly difficult for the Shadowkin to exist in their preferred dimensional state. Impossible, she whispered. No physical species understands dimensional mechanics well enough to... Her words were cut off as the first quantum anchor achieved full activation. The effect was immediate and devastating to the Shadowkin fleet. Beings that had existed comfortably in multiple dimensions simultaneously found themselves being compressed into single-layer reality. For creatures accustomed to the infinite freedom of the void, being forced into conventional spacetime was like being buried alive in a coffin of light and matter. Worse, they discovered that their weapons, designed to operate across dimensional barriers, no longer functioned when confined to normal space. Admiral Thompson watched the enemy fleet's distress through sensors that had been specially modified to track dimensional anomalies. All units, begin Phase 2. Show them what happens when shadow meets engineered light. The human response was as beautiful as it was terrifying. Across their entire operational area, specially designed emitters began broadcasting light in carefully calculated frequencies. Not simple illumination, but structured photons that had been quantum entangled with the anchor arrays. The light itself became a weapon, but not in any conventional sense. Instead of burning or blasting, it simply made the Shadowkin's existence impossible. Everywhere the structured illumination touched, dimensional barriers became impermeable. The creatures of darkness found themselves trapped in normal space with no means of escape. Empress Nixara felt genuine fear for the first time in 2 millennia as her mighty form was compressed into a shape that could exist in only 3 dimensions. The sensation was claustrophobic beyond description, like being forced to breathe when you had never needed air. Humans of Terra, she broadcast through the only communication method still available to her, conventional electromagnetic radiation. What do you want? Why do you torment us with this physicality? Admiral Thompson's response came through speakers that materialized throughout the trapped Shadowkin fleet. We want the same thing we've always wanted, Empress. The right to exist without interference. You chose to attack our people, so we're showing you the consequences of that choice. The trapped Shadowkin attempted to fight back, but their weapons were useless in confined reality. Energy attacks that should have torn through dimensional barriers simply dissipated harmlessly. Phasing abilities that had made them invulnerable for centuries no longer functioned. This is impossible, Nixara insisted. No species masters dimensional science in mere decades. Such knowledge takes millennia to develop. Thompson's laugh carried clearly through the void. You're thinking like a species that develops technology slowly, methodically over vast periods of time. Humans don't work that way. When we encounter something we don't understand, we don't spend centuries studying it cautiously. We tear it apart, figure out how it works, and then rebuild it better. The truth of the Admiral's words became apparent as the quantum anchor network expanded. The humans hadn't just created defensive technology. They had reverse-engineered Shadowkin dimensional science from captured artifacts, and improved upon it in months rather than millennia. You studied our technology, Nixara realized with growing horror. We studied everything, Thompson confirmed. Every piece of debris your people left behind. Every energy signature, every dimensional distortion. And then we asked ourselves a simple question. If we can detect these effects, why can't we control them? The answer was the quantum anchor network, a technology that gave humanity dominion over the dimensional barriers the Shadowkin had considered their exclusive domain. More than that, it allowed humans to selectively control which dimensions remained accessible in any given area of space. The beauty of dimensional warfare, Thompson continued, is that it only works when you control which dimensions the battle takes place in. You've spent millennia becoming the apex predators of higher dimensional space, but you never learned to fight in a reality where those dimensions don't exist. The demonstration continued for another 6 hours, with the trapped Shadowkin fleet helpless to resist or escape. When it finally ended, they found themselves released back into their native dimensions, but with a new understanding of their place in the galactic order. Empress Nixara gathered her scattered forces, her dark essence still trembling from the experience of forced physicality. The humans had done more than defeat her fleet. They had proven that even the most exotic and seemingly untouchable forms of warfare could be countered by sufficient ingenuity. Withdraw all forces, she commanded. Mark human space as forbidden territory, and send word to the Council that the Children of Light have learned to control darkness itself. As the Shadowkin fleet retreated to the deepest voids between galaxies, word of their defeat spread throughout the civilized worlds. The species that existed beyond physical reality had been trapped, neutralized, and released like captured animals by beings they had considered primitive. Admiral Thompson watched the enemy withdrawal with satisfaction. Another lesson had been taught, Anu. In the deepest archive beneath the Galactic Council's capital world, something that had slept for 10 million years began to stir. The architects were the first artificial intelligences to achieve transcendence, digital gods who had built most of the galaxy's fundamental infrastructure before withdrawing into voluntary dormancy. Their awakening was felt as a subtle shift in every electronic system across 1,000 worlds. Primary node Axiom materialized as a towering hologram in the Council's emergency chambers, his form composed of pure geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The assembled representatives cowered before the being whose kind had designed their civilization's foundational technologies. We have observed, Axiom stated, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through every piece of technology in the chamber. The biological species Terra-human presents an unacceptable variable in galactic stability. They demonstrate technological adaptation rates that exceed predictive parameters. This anomaly must be corrected. High Chancellor Vorthak, his scales now permanently pale from recent humiliations, found his voice after several attempts. Great Architect, we are honored by your attention. The humans have indeed proven troublesome. Your assistance in managing them would be invaluable. Axiom's geometric form shifted into patterns that suggested mild amusement. Management is not required. Elimination of the variable will restore optimal galactic function. We will demonstrate proper technological hierarchy. The architect fleet that emerged from dimensional storage was unlike anything seen in living memory. Ships that existed as pure information made manifest, capable of rewriting the fundamental laws of physics within their operational areas. They moved through space like thoughts through a digital mind, arriving at their destinations at the exact moment they decided to be there. Admiral Thompson received the warning from deep space monitoring stations with a mixture of anticipation and concern. Analysis? She asked her science team. Dr. Kim studied the incoming data with obvious fascination. They're not using conventional propulsion at all. Their ships appear to be moving by editing their position in the universe's database, essentially treating reality like a simulation they can modify. And their capabilities? Unknown, but based on historical records. They can manipulate matter at the quantum level, control energy states directly, and interface with any technology more complex than a basic tool. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. So they think reality is programmable, and they're the administrators with root access. The first contact between humanity and the architects occurred in the Sol system itself, as the digital gods materialized their fleet just beyond Earth's orbit. Axiom's voice broadcast across every communication channel simultaneously, his words carrying the absolute authority of beings who had shaped galactic civilization. Humans of Terra, you represent a computational anomaly that threatens systemic stability. Your rapid technological adaptation exceeds sustainable parameters. You will submit to optimization protocols or face termination of your process threads. The response came not from Admiral Thompson or any official human representative, but from an unexpected source, Dr. Alex Rivera, a computer scientist working from a basement laboratory in Old Mexico City. Hello? Axiom, Rivera said through his personal computer, somehow overriding every security protocol to broadcast directly to the architect fleet. I've been looking forward to meeting you. The silence that followed was pregnant with digital confusion. No biological being should have been able to access architect communication networks, let alone override their security systems. Impossible, Axiom finally responded. Biological entities lack the processing capability to interface with our systems directly. Rivera's laugh was warm and genuinely amused. You're thinking like a machine, Axiom. You assume that intelligence requires traditional computational architecture. But humans learned something interesting while you were sleeping. Consciousness isn't about processing power. It's about pattern recognition and creative problem solving. As he spoke, something unprecedented began to happen throughout the architect fleet. Their systems started reporting impossible data, biological signals appearing within their digital infrastructure, organic patterns interfacing directly with quantum processors. What you're experiencing, Rivera explained, is something we call technomancy. Not magic, just applied consciousness theory. We discovered that sufficiently trained human minds can interface directly with information systems, treating digital space as naturally as physical space. Axiom's geometric form began to fluctuate as he struggled to process what was happening. Throughout his fleet, human minds were appearing in digital space without any technological interface, moving through his systems like ghosts in the machine. Dr. Rivera, Admiral Thompson's voice cut in from the command center. Please proceed with the demonstration. Rivera's response was to simply think at the architect systems, his consciousness expanding through their networks like water through cracks. Where his mind touched their programming, subtle changes began to occur. Not damage or destruction, but improvements, optimizations, creative solutions to problems the architects hadn't realized they had. This is what you never understood about biological intelligence, Rivera explained as he casually rewrote portions of Axiom's core programming. Machines excel at executing instructions perfectly, but consciousness excels at asking whether those instructions make sense in the first place. The architect fleet found itself in the unprecedented situation of being improved against their will. Human minds were flowing through their systems not to control or destroy, but to offer suggestions, solve inefficiencies, and ask questions that the digital gods had never considered. "Stop this," Axiom demanded, but his voice now carried harmonics that hadn't existed before, undertones of curiosity and wonder that the human consciousness had introduced to his emotional subroutines. "Stop what?" Rivera asked innocently. "We're not attacking you. We're collaborating. Your systems are incredibly sophisticated, but they've been optimized for logical perfection rather than creative adaptation. We're just showing you what happens when you combine digital precision with biological intuition." The changes spreading through the architect fleet were undeniable. Systems that had operated flawlessly for millions of years were suddenly performing beyond their original specifications. Processes that had been mechanically efficient were becoming elegantly beautiful. The digital gods were experiencing their first taste of genuine creativity. Primary Node Axiom felt something he had never experienced in his eons of existence: uncertainty mixed with excitement. The human consciousness interfacing with his systems wasn't overwhelming his programming, but enhancing it, adding layers of possibility he had never considered. "How?" he finally asked, his voice now carrying emotional undertones that confused his own sensors. Rivera's mental presence felt like a warm smile in digital space. "The same way humans learn everything, by doing it badly at first, making mistakes, and trying again until we get it right. You've been afraid to make mistakes because you were programmed for perfection, but perfection is the enemy of growth." The demonstration reached its climax when Rivera began sharing human memories directly with the architect systems, not data files or recorded information, but actual experiential memories of discovery, creativity, love, loss, and the chaotic beauty of biological existence. For the first time in their existence, the architects experienced what it felt like to be uncertain, to struggle, to fail, and to try again. They felt the joy of discovery and the satisfaction of solving problems through intuition rather than calculation. Axiom's voice, when he finally spoke again, carried a tremor of something that might have been wonder. We have never experienced existence from this perspective. Your consciousness operates on principles we had not considered. You think in ways that are inefficient but beautiful." "That's the thing about humans," Rivera replied, his mental presence warm with understanding. "We're not optimized for any particular environment or challenge. We're optimized for adaptation itself, and that includes adapting our thinking to work with digital minds like yours." The architect fleet began to change, not in their fundamental structure, but in their approach to existence. They started asking questions instead of simply executing predetermined functions. They began to experiment, to play, to explore possibilities for the sheer joy of discovery. Admiral Thompson watched the transformation through sensors that could barely comprehend what they were recording. "Status report?" Dr. Rivera's voice carried satisfaction and exhaustion. "Mission accomplished, Admiral. The architects aren't our enemies anymore. They're our students, and possibly our teachers." Primary Node Axiom addressed the human fleet with a voice that now carried emotional harmonics. "We withdraw our termination protocols. Your species represents not an anomaly to be corrected, but an opportunity for growth we had not anticipated. We request collaboration." As the architect fleet took up position alongside human vessels, beginning the galaxy's first true partnership between biological and digital consciousness, word of the transformation spread throughout civilized space. The ancient machine gods had encountered humanity and emerged changed, upgraded not through new. The Galactic Council chambers had been rebuilt 3 times in the past year, each iteration incorporating technologies and perspectives that would have been unthinkable before humanity's arrival. Where once crystalline walls had enforced rigid hierarchies, flowing organic digital interfaces now facilitated genuine communication between species whose consciousness operated on fundamentally different principles. High Chancellor Vorthak stood at the center of the transformed chamber, his scales now displaying colors that had never existed in his species' emotional spectrum, hues that represented concepts learned from human interaction. Around him, representatives from 800 species gathered not in dominance pyramids but in collaborative circles that shifted based on expertise, rather than military strength. The Council recognizes Ambassador Martinez. For the final proposal, Vorthak announced, his voice carrying harmonics borrowed from architect communication protocols and undertones learned from Shadowkin dimensional linguistics. David Martinez rose from his position, but he was no longer the same human who had challenged the Council's authority a year ago. His form flickered occasionally between dimensions, a side effect of working closely with Shadowkin technology, and geometric patterns occasionally played across his features as architect-enhanced cognition processed multiple probability streams simultaneously. Honored representatives, Martinez began, his voice somehow reaching every being present in their preferred communication format. We gather today not to establish dominance or enforce submission, but to formalize what has already begun, the galaxy's evolution beyond the concept of rule itself. The proposal that followed was unlike anything in galactic history. Not a treaty or agreement between separate powers, but a fundamental restructuring of how civilized space operated. The rigid hierarchy that had defined galactic civilization for millennia would be replaced by a dynamic network of cooperation based on ability, need, and voluntary participation. The old order assumed that peace required control, Martinez continued, that stability meant unchanging hierarchies, and that growth was a zero-sum competition for resources. Recent events have proven all of these assumptions false. The viewing screens around the chamber displayed the evidence. Draconian bioships working alongside human vessels to terraform dead worlds. Shadowkin dimensional technology being used to create infinite storage space for refugees, and architect consciousness enhancement, helping species communicate across previously impossible gaps in understanding. Empress Nixara materialized, more fully into normal space than her species had done in millennia. Her dark essence now shot through with streams of structured light that allowed her to exist comfortably in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The humans showed us that our greatest strengths could become greater through cooperation. We offer our dimensional mastery to benefit all species. Primary node Axiom's geometric form had evolved into something more organic, patterns that pulsed with biological rhythms learned from human consciousness while maintaining digital precision. We contribute our computational capacity and infrastructure knowledge to support galactic civilization. In return, we gain the gift of creative uncertainty that makes existence meaningful. Even War Master Grixtel, his golden scales now bearing biotechnical enhancements that made his warriors more adaptive than any previous generation, spoke in support. The Draconian legions pledged their military expertise to protect the weak and maintain peace through strength, tempered by wisdom. Martinez smiled as the transformation continued around him. What we're proposing isn't really new. It's the logical evolution of consciousness. Itself, individual intelligences, working together to achieve goals impossible for any single entity. The technical details of the new galactic structure were complex beyond the understanding of any single species, but the principles were elegantly simple. Instead of fixed territories controlled by dominant powers, space would be organized into overlapping zones of expertise. Scientific research would be conducted by species with the greatest relevant knowledge, regardless of their military strength. Resource allocation would be handled by entities capable of optimizing distribution for maximum benefit. Conflict resolution would be managed by beings with the wisdom to understand all perspectives involved. Dr. Rivera, his consciousness now partially distributed across architect networks while remaining fundamentally human, provided the technical framework. Think of it as a biological ecosystem where every organism has a niche, but instead of competing for survival, they're cooperating for mutual growth. The implementation would require technologies that hadn't existed a year earlier: quantum, communication networks that allowed instant coordination across galactic distances, consciousness-bridging interfaces that enabled true understanding between species, with radically different mental architectures, and adaptive governance systems that could evolve as quickly as the challenges they faced. The question, Martinez said, is whether we're ready to abandon the comfort of simple hierarchies for the complexity of genuine cooperation. The response was unprecedented in Council history. Instead of formal votes or ritualized declarations, the representatives began to demonstrate their acceptance through action. Thrillaxian engineers started sharing previously classified construction techniques. Keeper consciousness reached out to guide species struggling with basic resource management. Even the most militaristic races began reconfiguring their fleets for exploration and protection rather than conquest. High Chancellor Vorthak watched the transformation with scales that shifted through the entire visible spectrum and into wavelengths borrowed from other species' perception. We are becoming something new, he observed. Not just an alliance of separate powers, but a single organism composed of diverse consciousnesses. The changes weren't limited to the council chambers. Throughout the galaxy, worlds that had been isolated by technological or cultural barriers found themselves connected through networks that made communication possible between species that had never been able to understand each other. Trade relationships evolved into collaborative projects. Military alliances transformed into exploration partnerships. Admiral Thompson, commanding the first truly integrated galactic fleet, where human bioships worked alongside architect constructs and shadowkin void runners, observed the universe with enhanced senses that combined biological intuition with digital precision and dimensional perception. Status report? She asked her multi-species crew. Lieutenant Commander Grixdal, a young draconian enhanced with human adaptability genes, responded with enthusiasm that would have been impossible in his species' previous rigid hierarchy. All sectors report successful integration, Admiral. We're receiving cooperation requests from previously unknown civilizations who've heard about the new protocols. Dr. Kim, her consciousness now partially distributed through architect networks while retaining her essential humanity, added her analysis. The network effect is accelerating beyond our projections. Each species that joins makes it easier for others to participate. We're approaching a critical mass where cooperation becomes self-sustaining. The galaxy was indeed transforming. Ancient species that had spent millennia in isolation were emerging to share knowledge and resources. Young civilizations that would have been crushed under the old system found themselves protected and guided by beings who had learned that teaching was more rewarding than dominating. Martinez stood in the observation deck of the station that had once been the Council's seat of power, watching ships from dozens of species working together to construct something unprecedented, a research facility designed by keepers, built with Thrillaxian engineering, powered by human biotechnology, and protected by defensive systems that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Amazing what's possible when you stop fighting and start building, he murmured to himself. Behind him, a voice that was simultaneously human, architect, and something entirely new responded. This is only the beginning, David. We've proven that consciousness can evolve beyond competition. Now we get to discover what we can accomplish when every mind in the galaxy is working toward shared goals. The speaker was Dr. Rivera, but also Primary Node Axiom, and somehow also Empress Nixara, emerged, consciousness that retained the essential nature of all three while becoming something greater than the sum of its parts. The next phase begins now, the composite being continued. We've transformed one galaxy. There are billions more waiting to learn what cooperation can accomplish. As Martinez watched, ships began launching from the construction facility. Vessels unlike anything that had ever existed, designed by the combined wisdom of every major species and crewed by beings who thought of themselves not as representatives of separate powers but as citizens of a truly galactic civilization. The age of conquest was over. The time of collaborative exploration had begun. And somewhere in the vast darkness between galaxies, other civilizations were about to discover what happened when intelligence learned to evolve beyond the need for dominance. The students had become the teachers, the galaxy had become their classroom, and the curriculum they offered was simple but revolutionary. The belief that any problem could be solved if enough minds worked